copper, is a lot of things, but it's no panacea for bad form or for lack of practice or other mechanics that can go into how your gun performs and how you shoot.
Welcome to the National Wildlife Federation Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Drew Youngdyke. Today with me is my colleague, Director of Conservation Partnerships for Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, Jason Dinsmore. He works with me here at the National Wildlife Federation. And we're recording this from our Great Lakes office in Ann Arbor because Jason's in town because, like me this past weekend, he was up at his family deer camp. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about deer, white-tailed deer, deer hunting, deer camp, deer diseases, deer regulations, all things deer. So if you're not into deer hunting, this is probably not your episode. But if you are, listen up. Jason, thanks for joining me. How's your deer season going so far?
All is good. Not to be undersold, I suppose. For those not interested in deer hunting, I hope you tune in because so many of us who enjoy the outdoors cut our teeth deer hunting. My first time in the woods following my dad and my grandfather was in their boots, oversized as they were, chasing after them in the deer woods. And while I've widened my path much beyond deer hunting these days, I think most of us cut our teeth on the sport.
Yeah, and actually, I cut my teeth on squirrels. So
yes.
out there in the woods this past weekend, it still takes a lot for me not to put the scope on a squirrel and think, the deer aren't working out so far, and that squirrel's chattering and looks really delicious. But I held off. And,
well, knowing you, I'm sure the scope was still on the squirrel, just the finger wasn't on the trigger.
Safety was off. I'll save my iron sights. Old 1892 Marlin lever action for those this winter. I picked up some copper 22s.
I saw that
for that. So hopefully I'll get up after some squirrels in northern Michigan's public land this winter. But I was just up there this past weekend for deer camp as well. I know you were up at your family's deer camp, which you've hosted us as well as our Michigan affiliate, Michigan United Conservation Club, for a few years now during grouse season. How'd your deer camp go this year?
Deer camp is great. Deer camp's always a fun tradition. Get out in the woods with friends and family. Obviously it's a well-worn tradition here in Michigan. I think our camp was probably a lot like everyone else's. Everyone's getting a little older, a little longer in the tooth, a little grayer. And we've lost a number of family members, either aging out or just life catching up over the years. And so what was maybe 5-6 of us has whittled down to 2 or 3. And I think emblematic of all things hunting sports, it's incumbent upon us to make sure we're bringing that next generation along, which is in the works. My sons are not quite old enough, but getting close. But no, it was a great camp. It's always good to kind of come home to Michigan. Down in Minnesota, I really look forward to this time to be in the woods with friends and family.
Did you have any success?
Yeah, well, it's a loaded term, right? But I did have a chance to pull the trigger. I was seeing deer pretty early on Saturday, kind of watching stuff come through, trying to find my shots. I was able to take a doe Saturday afternoon. So the second day of season, put some meat in the freezer and then hunt harder for something with antlers. But that never happened, but at least I got the doe in the freezer.
What were you shooting for that?
That was, I had my 7mm with me, so 7mm Remington Magnum, and using Barnes TSX loaded Federal Premium ammunition.
Okay. I was similarly set up with not a 7mm Magnum, but a 7mm 08 Weatherby Vanguard, with Federal Premium copper ammunition for that too. I did not get to pull the trigger. I was still hunting out of our deer camp up in the Pigeon River Country State Forest. Over 4 days, I saw 4 deer. The first 2 I bumped, so they were running away, and I don't take running shots. But man, I got the drop on Sunday on 2 does, and normally I hunt when I'm still hunting, carrying my gun horizontally.
At the ready.
At the ready. But, it starts getting tired after a while, and, I'll put it up, and I'll sling it over my shoulder for a little bit. And, of course, it was at that moment that they came out, just this appeared like apparitions out of nowhere in the forest, which is one of the things I love about
deer in the mist.
Deer hunting, yeah. But still, with the cover being still, I was able to pull the gun off my shoulder, ready it, aim it. Had the doe in my sights, safety off, about to take that breath and pull the trigger, and I just had this last second nagging thought, wait, is that a button buck? Let me check to make sure it's not. And I should have known just from the size of the deer it wasn't, but just that split second of hesitation, they blew, they're gone, they're running up the hill. I tried to loop around up the hill around, and maybe they blew and started walking, and I could catch them on the backside, but I didn't see them again. And that was, when you're still hunting and you only have a couple of days, you kind of get that one chance, and you either take advantage of it or you're going home meatless.
Yeah, it's definitely a good problem. You saw a deer, you had a good time in the woods. You had a chance to hang out with your dad and brother and others up at camp. You bring up a good point as far as one of those tenets of gun safety, just the certainty of target. And not only were you making certain things behind it were in good order, but also the animal itself. What you were hoping to pull the trigger on was what you wanted it to be, and that's something that I think can't get instilled enough. Just looking over the news reports, clippings over the last couple of weekends here, the unfortunate incidences of gun safety mishaps. People either putting casing loaded guns and having them fire, accidentally, but the gun's doing what it's supposed to do. Something pulled the trigger and it's firing, and it's up to us as the users of those tools to make sure that they're used in a proper manner.
I don't know if that's happening more often now, or if those incidents are getting wider media attention now than they ever have.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make every time that happens, it doesn't make the community look good. And of course, it's a tragedy for the individuals involved. I don't know what it's going to take for hunters to hunker down. And while gun safety is widespread, I mean, let's face it, we don't know the final numbers from this year, but last year there were 500,000 deer hunters in Michigan. Right. So when you have 500,000 deer hunters, and you have a handful of incidents, the percentage is pretty low, but each one of those is tragic. Each one of those
has a name attached to it. Each one of those has a story behind it that unfortunately met with some manner of tragedy, and that's, I think, the biggest lesson of all that is preventable. At the end of the day, with good gun safety, with good background, with good knowledge and intent, those things don't happen. And so, what you hate to hear more and more is just when kids are involved, obviously. I think one of them was a gentleman who putting a loaded firearm in a case and shot through a wall of his own home and injured two of his children. Yeah, you hate to hear that too. It's obviously any type of innocent bystanders, but anytime this happens, just knowing that it's preventable, knowing that we need to do all we can within our community, self-policing, and making sure that we're doing all we can individually to not do that to others, obviously.
A little bit lighter of a subject matter, but along the same lines of self-policing. We both talked about how we're both using copper ammunition. You've been using it for quite a while. This is only my second year using it. I didn't switch until actually I came to work here at the National Wildlife Federation. Started reading all of our resolutions on why we encourage hunters to use non-lead ammunition and the reasons why. And
you came to the right side, force.
Yeah, well, and I'll be honest, and that's why I have a lot of understanding for hunters that are reluctant to switch. I wasn't reluctant to switch. It had just frankly never occurred to me. I had never, it had never entered my thought process of why I should switch from lead to copper until I read about it, until I became aware of it. And so I always say that, if it's okay if you haven't heard about this and you haven't switched yet, there's no blame on you. You didn't know. Right. But now you've heard us talk about it, and now you know. Now you got to check it out. Yep. But you've been using it for years and years. How long have you been using copper ammunition, and why did you start using it? What's your experience been with it?
So I started using copper, it's been almost, it was just before I came to NWF, so probably a little more than 8 years,
Okay.
8 to 10 years now, when Barnes, which is one of the major, by no means the only, but one of the major manufacturers of copper ammunition out there, started becoming more available, as far as, in the stores, different loadings, different availability for components, and that was only reloading. They weren't doing factory ammunition at that time. I was a reloader, no longer. I no longer had the time for it, unfortunately.
Before kids, right?
Yes, before kids, before wife. Well, I guess I was married at the time, but still, before kids, regardless. The reason I went to it was actually, knowing that, just reading up on things like lead toxicity. I did a lot of wildlife disease, not necessarily research, but using research in a policy platform, both in my previous occupation as a lobbyist here in Michigan for MECC and as a policy analyst for them, in addition to my work here at National Wildlife Federation, transforming kind of education and background research into policy, coming across more and more research on lead toxicity, not only in wildlife, but also in humans. The way I turned on to lead was not necessarily from a pure wildlife perspective, but just knowing that my goal anytime I harvest an animal is turning that into food. And knowing that so much of that, going from farm to table, going from field to table, is that ethically, not only is it harvested in an ethical manner, but also that you're providing the most organic, the most kind of free range, in addition to healthiest perspective of protein. Lead doesn't really factor into any of those equations.
Right.
and so I was, from a more of a food safety perspective, changing over to copper. Happy to see now that Barnes and many others are producing factory loaded ammunition. I no longer reload. You don't reload. And yet, going to the local sporting goods store, mine in Minnesota, yours here in Michigan, we're able to find readily available, over the counter, reasonably priced, and very effective ammunition options.
Well, and I'll be honest, the sporting goods store that I prefer to use, I can find copper ammunition for the Model 70s, the 30-06s that I have, but I generally prefer, because I still hunt, I'm moving around a lot. I've got a composite stock, Weatherby Vanguard carbine,
Sure.
So it's lightweight. It's
Shorter barrel, easier in the woods.
Yep, 7mm 08, it's a tack driver. But I couldn't find that ammunition. It's not quite as popular of a caliber,
Right.
obviously, as a 30-06. But I was able to order through Bass Pro Shops online.
Okay.
Living in Michigan, you can order online.
Nice,
I know not all states you can, but I was able to order ammunition online, both for that, for my dad's 243, for my cousin's 270. I was actually able to outfit all of our deer camp this year with copper ammunition.
Did we give you a raise?
No, it's when we do deer camp, and maybe yours is the same. Like, everybody contributes a little something different, So my brother actually bought the Cabela's Outfitter tent that we all use.
Very nice.
We used to have this old Montana canvas on, which makes a great.
Well, if he's buying that, you got it off easy buying the ammunition.
Yeah, and we had this old 12x20 Montana canvas tent, but it was used.
Okay.
And it hadn't really been taken care of, put away wet, that
dry
kind of
rotted.
stuff.
Yeah.
And one year, my brother's business is doing okay, and he just shows up with his brand new Cabela's Outfitter
Very nice.
tent, and so that's his contribution. My mom will buy food for all of us.
Oh, yeah.
That's my dad's contribution. My cousin actually does screen printing as a side gig, so he'll do up T-shirts, that say our deer camp on it. Everybody kind of chips in on food, and so when I said, okay, well, I'll supply all the ammo.
That's great.
And for my dad and brother's guns, I sighted them in, made sure they were dead on, of course. And so that was my contribution, but I kind of had the ulterior motive of offering that to make sure we're all using copper as well.
No, that's amazing. You raise a really good point as far as availability. I'm fortunate. The calibers I shoot more often than not for big game. 30-06 or the 7mm mag, or more widely available. And so as you radiate out from there into the less common or more boutique rounds, and not to say that 7mm at 8 is boutique, but it's still less common than 30-06.
Though we still like to think of it as like a wildcat round,
Right.
even though it's been made commercially
Yeah, exactly.
since like 80. But
Exactly. You're going to find some of those problems. I'm sure that until manufacturing kind of catches up to that and supply catches up to that as well. I face the same thing in some of my upland bird chamberings and loads. Obviously not rifling long and moving over to shotgun, but I shoot a 16 gauge. My side by side is a 16 gauge, and that's something that you aren't going to find normal rounds for 16 gauge on the shelf very often in some of those stores. Definitely not non-toxic, and unless it's something more specialized for 3-inch. I need just a 2 3/4 for an old 16 gauge. That's going to be bismuth or some other type of non-tox, and I've got to order that same as you. I ordered that online. It's readily available, and as long as you order a couple boxes at a time, it's usually free shipping. And once again, you got to plan ahead.
and that's the thing. I did this, at least a month ago. Maybe a little bit more. Just to make sure I had time, and then you've also got to plan for when do I have time to get to the range and make sure that find out where the slightly different zero that it might have than the previous ammunition. Obviously, if you're shooting a 140 grain copper bullet, that's going to have a slightly different zero than the 130 lead bullet that I might have been using before.
Well, the ballistic coefficients can be different. Just the size for calibers can be a little bit different as far as length. Just to get that same weight out of it, copper's going to perform differently than lead, just like any of the other metals.
And differently, but not worse. I think that's where one of those misconceptions comes in. I think there's probably some folks that might buy that first box of copper ammo. And take it to the range, and they've been zeroed in on this spot with their regular lead cartridge. Now they're using a different one, and it's off. And somebody might think, man, that's that ammunition. No, you got to re-zero for that new ammunition and look at where your groupings are. And what I found was my 7mm 08. I'd shot with a 30 out, I'd shot with this. I'm like, what am I going to use? Boy, shooting. For me it was a 140 grain 7mm 08 loads, just the way they were shooting, the way they were grouping. I was like, I'm using this one this year.
Nice. Well, copper, is a lot of things, but it's no panacea for bad form or for lack of practice or other mechanics that can go into how your gun performs and how you shoot. When you hit the spot you're trying to hit, when you're doing your job, it's going to do the same job that any lead-based ammunition is going to do, but it's not going to solve other problems. And so, back from my reloading days, I remember there was, dozens, any number of opportunities or options for a 223 or whatever caliber you may choose to shoot. You just got to figure out for individual copper chamberings and opportunities in your caliber. Making sure you find the one that shoots right with your gun, just like you would with lead ammunition.
And we've talked about a lot about the specific chamberings and that kind of thing, how it performs. And I think that the way that more hunters are going to adopt this is by seeing the superiority of the way that it performs. Because when we're talking about copper, generally we're talking about premium ammunition.
Yes.
And so you can't really compare it price wise to your kind of bargain basement ammunition.
Your white box
ammunition.
Yeah,
if you're going to compare it price wise, you have to compare it to other premium ammunition. But the reason that we're doing this, and the reason that I switched coming to the Wildlife Federation, you did just before that, in addition to the performance, was to avoid the impacts to wildlife. And I think similar to some of those hunting accidents, although I say there's no accidents, there's only things that we should have prevented by listening to the very first thing we're taught in hunter safety. But moving on from that to why we switched to copper, the other thing we keep seeing, and again, I'm not sure if it's happening more often or if every time it happens, it's getting wider press play, more headlines out of it, is every time we see an eagle poisoned by lead. It seems like it happens every time around this year during firearm deer season. You see the reports out of the Raptor Center at the University of Minnesota. You see them at the Recovery Center in Wisconsin. We saw one recently at the Chocolate Raptor Center up in Marquette. And that was, they suspected from fishing tackle. But we see these impacts of lead on wildlife, particularly loons with fishing tackle, and especially in our region, at least Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, we tend to see those impacts with bald eagles. Here in Michigan, I think hunters sometimes say, well, it happens. But that's not what non-hunters say. That's not what the rest of the state says. What kind of reaction do you get where you live in Minnesota when those type of articles hit?
It's interesting. Minnesota's unique in that we have both the bald and the golden eagles. Golden eagles are coming through on a bit of more of a migration up and down the Mississippi. Much like Michigan, our bald eagles are year-round residents, although they do some little bit of micro migrations within the state, but stick close to the big water. We've got a lot of them. Honestly, they've done an amazing job. When I say they, as the states, as the federal partners, as the local partners in recovery, from the 70s on, and they've exploded. And so we have, I think, with that many eagles around, we kind of become more numb, maybe, to the recovery efforts that are still underway with a lot of birds of prey, that just because I see them on a daily basis. I know my colleagues in Minnesota see them on a daily basis. We have eagle nests in our backyards. We have, and so I don't think it probably hits us the same as it does in Michigan or other areas where people don't necessarily see them as often.
Well, even here in Ann Arbor, there was one about a month or so ago that was sighted on the Huron River.
Oh yeah. It's great to see, and it's great that you've seen that expansion occur. It's great that you've seen those rebounds occur. So I think it hits differently in different communities based on kind of what's around and what's available to them. Obviously, loon. I'm not sure if it's truly. I think it is a Minnesota state bird. You see that. The Minnesota Lottery is the loon logo. The loon is kind of ubiquitous in Minnesota for Northwoods. I'm sure similar to here in Michigan, but. That one seems to hit harder. I think because of that state bird, kind of implication, and you do see a backlash in some manner. What you'll see also is you'll see petitions that was just filed this year seeking to ban use of lead in both hunting and fishing. You'll see resurgence of that on an annual basis. So those discussions popping up with DNR, with legislators, with others, seeking solutions. And I think those discussions are great. I think that it's important that we look at what's happening around us and kind of help spurn debate and discussion to determine how best to kind of solve any individual problem. And I think in Minnesota and in Michigan, I think that those debates are good. I think that they're ongoing.
Well, and at the national level, folks should know, and I should reiterate that we are not pushing for regulation or ban when we talk about this from National Wildlife Federation.
Correct.
We're encouraging you as a hunter, as an angler, to voluntarily, on your own, choose to use non-lead alternatives. But I think that you're right, is that as you see more headlines, and I do think there is more headlines because there are more of these incidents, and that's actually because there are more eagles. I often see the comment, man, we've been using lead for years, it hasn't been a problem. Yeah, well, eagles were on the endangered species list before. There weren't that many of them. They've recovered now. There's more of them. There's more of them on the landscape. It means they're more likely to come into contact with the gut pile that you left from your deer than they were a few years ago, because there's more of them out there. And so those incidents are still going to occur, and it's still our responsibility as hunters. And this kind of goes back to those quote-unquote accidental shootings, is we have to be aware and cognizant of what's behind our target in space. We're always taught that, right? You got to know your target and what's behind it. But we also need to understand what's behind our target in time. And that's what happens with these eagles, is you might leave your gut pile out there, it's got some lead fragments, and it only takes a couple lead fragments, in some cases, to poison an eagle that ends up, it's obviously bad for the wildlife itself. We don't want to do that as ethical hunters. We don't want to harm non-target wildlife. But that's a bad look for hunters when that ends up on the headline. And that's when you face these kind of calls of petitions from different groups seeking bans and restrictions. You get that because these incidents are occurring. And that's kind of the question of, we can't deny that these incidents are occurring. That's a fact. They just are. But we can control how we approach that. Now, as we're advocating for voluntary approaches understand one of the benefits of adoption of this voluntary approach is that if more hunters and anglers do change over and do that voluntarily, there will be fewer of these incidents, and you will have fewer groups calling for those type of bans.
Sure.
That's one of those things that us as a hunting and fishing community, policing ourselves, can stave off some of those more strict restrictions, but that requires us actually as a community having more widespread adoption of the non-lead alternatives so that we have fewer of these incidents.
Yeah, and manufacturing process seems to be catching up a little bit. We mentioned before the it's more available on the shelves, if you will. And there's always a chicken or an egg kind of conundrum there. As far as manufacturing goes, is it manufacturing that's driving demand, or is demand driving manufacturing? And right now there seems to be more kind of demand amongst our groups, amongst kind of wildlife professionals and individual enthusiasts out there that hopefully that they're going to start providing more options for us as hunters, as sportsmen and women, and that will then in turn kind of spur more adoption, more use, more widespread use, where we aren't going to have necessarily nearly as much lead in the environment just voluntarily.
When I post or share an article about non-lead alternatives, I'm surprised by how many people within my kind of hunting cohort, folks that I know either from previous jobs or events, or you accumulate your cohort or your network, right? And I'm surprised by how many people say, "Oh yeah, I've been using it for years." Now I don't want to pretend that my cohort isn't extremely conservation focused. Right. I've kind of developed my cohort from, members of backcountry hunters and anglers, other people who work, for National Wildlife Federation or affiliates.
Like-minded individuals.
Right. So, we're talking about hunters and anglers who are involved either on a volunteer or professional level with conservation organizations for the most part, but still a lot more than I would expect that just voluntarily said, not, hey, I'll try it, but hey, I've been using it for years. And that's kind of encouraging to see. I think as we see that become more widespread, we will see a response from industry to make it more widely available. As you have it more widely available, you're going to see those prices come down too when it's not such a rare find on the shelf, right?
No, absolutely. And I think you made the point earlier about kind of comparing apples to apples. I don't think any of us are going to compare the cheapest, you pick your college beer, whatever it may have been back in the day. Pabst, I think was mine. That's
Busch Light for us, I think.
That and Steel Reserve. You're not going to compare that to the microbrew that you're buying today.
Right.
You look at just consumer demands and the explosion of the microbrew industry. I don't think anyone's thinking that Bud Light's out there to compete with something that's coming out of Grand Rapids or what have it. I'm thinking Bells, what have it. I know it's not Grand Rapids, regardless. Same thing with some of the copper bullets opportunity. All of it's coming in premium ammunition. And so I understand that. I think the industry understands that. At some point, we're going to have to stratify that a little bit so that you have lower cost availability of copper while still offering a premium product. So there's going to be a need for that. I remember growing up, we didn't buy premium ammunition. You bought the Remington Core Locked, PowerPoint Plus, green in the green box, green and yellow box. And it was, I think, like $10 at Meijer, kind of thing.
And the same box might last many, many years.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And really, if you're thinking about going out to deer camp, you can't really say that you can't afford the premium ammunition if you're buying the premium beer.
Right. Well, and
think about what's
that was the analogy I was trying to
think about what's really important, to your deer hunting, right? And look, we're not advocating drinking and firearms combining, but at deer camp after the hunt is over, some folks have some beers and play some cards, but you can get the premium ammunition in the cheap beer.
Well, I think
and that will kind of send a strong message about, I think, where your priorities lie in deer hunting. Right?
I think that was my inartful analogy, was just the fact that, in each of the things that we do, we determine, where our values are, whether we value the more premium product or the less one because we can get away with it, or for whatever reason it suits our needs better at the time. I think my argument would be that, my hope would be that my colleagues, my cohorts, and my fellow sports people in the woods would value both their health, their children's health, and as well as the healthy environment around them by choosing to shoot copper.
Well, and for me, in addition to reading those resolutions that our state affiliates have passed over the years encouraging the use of non-lead ammunition, and understand that from the wildlife perspective, the way that I hunt, still hunting on public land, my opportunities are very few and far between. It's been a couple years since I got a deer during firearms season. It was a nice 3.5-year-old 8-point, but it's been a couple years because when you still hunt, those opportunities, as I was describing earlier today, you make it harder on yourself. So when you get that opportunity, you don't want anything going wrong. This year I went wrong because I hesitated too much. But when I take that shot, I want to know that that's not what's going to go wrong. So to me, it's worth it to get that premium ammunition so that those rare opportunities that come along when I'm using the method that I prefer to use for a variety of reasons, when that opportunity comes along, I want the best product.
Sure.
Making sure that that's not the part that goes wrong.
Well, you got to be careful with marketing because you're really close to Heavy Shots tagline. I didn't come for this far to miss, or whatever. Whatever it's called. It goes to that same same discussion about just preparedness. Yeah. I rail my dad on this one. So because he's the type. Growing up, he was the type that you might shoot your gun once a year. And it's like the day before opening day. Yep. and then you're heading into the field. You have no idea as far as equipment. You have no idea as far as your gun, yourself. Are you in shape for it? Are you ready for it? Are you ready for the hunt? Are you ready to experience what you need to do in the field in addition to getting that animal out of the field? My dad is classic in this, where he doesn't necessarily do any of that stuff, and I'll typically get to camp with him, and at that point read him the riot act. And so it goes back to that. Typically for those of us who are, whether it's carrying a bow or carrying a gun, we're going to make sure we're proficient with that. We're going to make sure that our equipment is ready for the day. As far as our scopes, as far as our other optics, our packs, what we're packing into the field. And bullets are no different. What you're choosing to put in that firearm is just as important as what's sitting on top of it in way of optics or anything else. And so you want to know when you pull that trigger, not only is that bullet going to go where it's supposed to go, it's going to perform the way it needs to perform. And that's going to be the expansion. That's going to be kind of the reliability of it. And obviously, that's one thing you do get from a premium ammunition is that reliability. But also it comes with practice. Any bullet, any platform, you're going to want to make sure you take it to the field and really get proficient with it.
There's something else that has been going on in the Michigan deer season this year too, and when you talked about your apples to apples comparison, I think that's what reminded me of this. Oh yeah. In Michigan, we have a new bait ban.
Apple knockers.
Apple knockers, yeah. So I think it's important to talk about this because I don't think there's a bigger controversy going on in hunting in Michigan, and I think it's a touch point that's relevant for any state dealing with CWD. I know Wisconsin went through this a few years ago. How we manage CWD, chronic wasting disease, in states that have it, how we balance reducing the risk and speed of the spread of the disease with hunter opportunity to take more deer. Has really been a lightning rod, and I don't think this year has been any hotter than right here in Michigan. The Natural Resources Commission passed the bait ban over a year ago in 2018, and they did that not going into effect in 2018, but not until this year, to give both the farmers who grew it and hunters who used it at least a year to adapt and figure out their plan for this year. But now that it's gone through, we've seen a flurry of legislative activity of the Michigan legislature trying to go around the professional wildlife biologist recommendations at the DNR and actually take away the ability of the Natural Resources Commission to regulate bait. And it's been a touch point here in Michigan because it's not just about baiting and it's not really just about CWD. Because back in 1996, Michigan voters, and this was led by Michigan United Conservation Clubs, which is NWF's Michigan affiliate, and actually the former employer for both Jason and I, although at different times. So we through our time there, we know all about Proposal G, even though it was passed after both of us, or before both of us worked there. But what this says is that the Michigan voters, by 2/3 majority, said we want, rather than politicians in the legislature making wildlife management decisions, we want professional wildlife biologists making those decisions through the Natural Resources Commission, which is a citizens commission. And that's been the status quo for almost 30 years now, and really before that, but that's where it was really memorialized. And now the legislature is trying to go around that. Jason, you have a lot of experience both with the Natural Resources Commission, with that system, with the history of it. Why is that so dangerous for politicians to be trying to make wildlife management decisions contrary to professional wildlife biologists?
Well, nothing happens in a vacuum, right? And one of the concerns, both of the citizenry as well as those who brought Proposal G forward back in the mid-90s, was that, honestly, wildlife decisions, decisions that are good for wildlife, good for people that use wildlife, good for people that enjoy wildlife, aren't always popular. And not only that, but we didn't necessarily want the health of our wild deer herds, wild turkey, whatever else may have been that's falling under DNR control and oversight. We didn't want them to be left to the whims of any political majority. I don't think it's appropriate to be horse trading on the backs of a healthy deer herd. And I think that at the time it was bear. Bear baiting was the major issue in bear hunting, and some of the techniques and methodologies back then that really brought Proposal G, and the corollary was Proposal D that we voted down.
Right.
I say we as in Michigan voters. I was too young to vote at the time. I was only 16.
Yep.
I think you were too, probably, weren't you?
Oh, we're the same age. Class of 98,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
we're the same age.
Regardless.
The last year of Gen X, I like to point out.
Yes. Yeah, I wear that proudly. I think we share a mutual, regardless, yes. So yeah, I think that's the biggest thing is really a disdain for some of the political horse trading that occurs when it comes time to debate and discuss at the time the health of our wild herds, and a need to return to a science-based methodology under the North American Wildlife Conservation Model, and others that were producing good results around the U.S. To bring that home to Michigan. It worked well. It still works well. I think this is a battle that once again. As I said before, nothing exists in a vacuum. It's not only baiting that's really on the table here. It's a bit of a the horse's nose in the tent, the camel's nose in the tent, whatever the analogy is. Where I'm really concerned if this is taken, what's next? And not only a slippery slope, but just there's no reason for it. At the end of the day, you look at our neighbors, you look at others who are dealing with chronic wasting disease. I think the worst case scenarios aren't too far from us. They're a border away. When you look at what's happening in Wisconsin, what Wisconsin has endured since 2002, when they first found chronic wasting disease or first tested positive, really the spirals downward, not only in hunting participation, but also just the cost that spiraled up, and an amazing amount of cost being borne by their DNR.
Well, and let's be really clear here, because when people say let's learn from the lessons from what Wisconsin did or didn't do, the mistake Wisconsin made was not in first trying to enact control measures to actually control the spread of disease. The mistake was in abandoning those efforts in the face of some pushback from certain segments of the hunting population. And that's the point that we see ourselves now. When people say don't follow, that Michigan shouldn't follow Wisconsin's example, that's the point that we're at now. We've adopted some measures that wildlife biologists, that frankly the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which is literally all of the DNRs of all the states getting together, agree, and there's abundant scientific studies showing that link between baiting, the artificial congregation of cervids, and the spread of wildlife disease. And now we're at that point where we've instituted that ban on baiting for that purpose, recommended by wildlife biologists, and actually Kelly Straka, the chief veterinarian for the DNR, gave an impassioned testimony against this bill in the Senate committee. I actually testified there along with Amy Trotter, executive director of our affiliate, the Michigan United Conservation Clubs. And to hear her defense and how much she cares about the deer herd, and you have the chief veterinarian, you have a wildlife biologist who really knows her stuff, almost be completely disregarded by the Senate committee because the Senate majority leader says, well, I hunted deer one time and I saw some deer congregating, so I know better. That kind of anecdotal, observation from one guy one time overriding the years of experience of professional wildlife biologists who spend their careers working on this, I think is where that danger lies. Anytime that we substitute our own individual personal observation that is limited to our own personal experience and the time and place that happened, and try to substitute that for wildlife biologists who are studying the collective experiences of multiple people and the wildlife itself, I think is where we run into trouble. That's why even though when I was up in deer camp, there seemed to be a lot fewer camps on the roads up in the state forest where we set up our deer camp, and we kind of speculated, we worried, is that because of the bait ban? And maybe it is, but I also don't want to make that broad generalization because it's too few mile block where I hunt just happen to have fewer deer camps than there normally are, right?
Yeah.
Like that observation is limited to our specific area and experience. So we'll wait for the numbers to come out.
Yeah, it's too early to draw too many distinctions there. I sympathize with the hunters who are impacted by this. I grew up hunting in northeastern Lower Peninsula in the TB zone. DMU 452. Not too far from Hawks was I guess the closest town that our hunting camp used to be located at. My grandparents had since sold that off, unfortunately, but that's where I cut my teeth deer hunting, and that's right in club country. That is, for the Lower Peninsula at least, that was the epicenter for baiting, for a lot of the things that were occurring through the 70s and 80s as far as hunt camp development. And that was also the epicenter for bovine tuberculosis, bovine TB. That the first real bait bans that occurred in the state in the mid 90s were mid to late 90s were located there, and that was kind of the start of some of these discussions about artificial congregation of animals, what type of relationship is there between baiting and the spread of disease. I put feeding right there with it. It's not just baiting, it's baiting and feeding. And so any type you artificially congregate animals, cervids among them, you're going to have an increased risk of communicable disease occurring. This disease is chronic wasting disease is a little different than many others, but it is communicable. It does animal to animal, in addition to animal to environment to animal. And so, I sympathize with those who grew up hunting, who learned how to hunt behind a pile of carrots or beets or corn or whatever it may be, having to change. It's a hard change to make. I've moved to Minnesota since then. Minnesota's never had baiting, to my knowledge. It is illegal to bait in Minnesota to hunt deer, and so that they have an entire system of hunting and tradition of hunting that is different than ours here. And I think
and that's probably a good chance for folks from other states. And Jason and I are both from Michigan, so when we start talking about this, we kind of understand what we mean. But if you're from a different state, you probably have different hunting traditions in your state. In Michigan, especially in northern Michigan, baiting has just been part of what people have grown up with. I think in DNR studies, about 50% of Michigan hunters in past seasons have used bait, about 50%, and more as you go north, and about 80% in the UP, where most of the UP you still can. There's a CWZ zone where you can't, but it's the Lower Peninsula where it's been banned completely. So it is a change. And actually, club country. This is a complete aside.
You got a tangent for us?
I got a tangent. I got a squirrel I got to chase. The Sporting Club is one of the first novels by Tom McGain. And it's a fictionalized account of one of the traditional, sporting clubs in club country. in Michigan. That's just a great read. It's a novel, but it kind of gives you that sense, at least from his perspective, at least,
Sure.
of kind of what those clubs were like. So complete tangent,
Right.
but really part of the tradition of Michigan deer hunting, but also not the only tradition. I told you earlier off air, my dad's who taught me how to still hunt, and he learned to still hunt
Sure.
from my grandpa, and that used to be the tradition even before baiting.
Right.
And
Well,
people
baiters used to get teased going over the bridge. They called them apple knockers, and they'd rip them all sorts of ways for bringing bait up
and
the
now it's
peninsula.
80%, right?
Yes, yeah.
But some of us
Yeah.
still hunt. And actually, my dad is 68 years old. As he'll say, probably about 50, 60 pounds heavier than he ought to be. He went out
Are we
still
all?
hunting. I think he covered 4 miles.
Yeah.
And understand, when you still hunt, you go really slow. But what we'll also do is we'll go really slow through the areas that are likely for heavy deer sign, and we'll go a little bit
Right.
faster to get through
Sure.
different areas to those. And I think he ended up covering 4 or 5 miles.
Yep.
As a 68-year-old, that's a little bit heavier, but a lifetime still hunter for the most part. So when I hear people being like, "Well, you can't bait," what about folks that are getting older? I mean, I just got to tell them that, there
Sure.
are other ways to hunt, and
Well, yeah, and I think important in this too. There's, I don't want to. I know you don't either. Impugn anyone's ethics. At the point at which it was allowable, fine. Different strokes for different folks would have it. I get that. I get how baiting became popular. I understand that from my roots. In starting this, and that if all you have is a 40 or an 80 or whatever size section of land you happen to be hunting with your family and friends, and you've got 4 or 5 folks who are going to be on that 40, 60, 80, whatever size piece of property, you aren't going to be wandering through those woods. You got to be somewhat more sedentary. And if you don't have the time and the resources to set in food plots or create lanes or other things, you got to figure out how to bring them to you. And you don't necessarily have the time to scout, or you don't have the ability to public land access. If you're in southern Michigan, we don't have that same dynamic kind of public land opportunity you have further north. All these things factor into to why baiting became popular, and why it still has a certain hold on a number of our hunters here in the state. And I get that. I 100% get that. That was, like I said, that was my roots growing up. We hunted 80. We had an 80-acre parcel in Hawks. There was, between 4 and 6 of us that hunted it. It was perfectly safe. It was fully wooded. You had your individual shooting lanes that you were shooting in directions and you knew kind of where others were going to be. But at the same time, you weren't scouting, you weren't walking, it was 4 hours from home. You might get up there the day before opener, and you'd hit the woods. And so in that scenario, it's very hard to tell someone who's baited for the last 20 years that they just can't today. Now that said,
they told them last year.
They told them last year, but also
they would this year.
This is not a hunting ethics discussion. If this was a purely hunting ethics discussion, I think that those are all perfectly viable and reasonable discussion topics. We've moved beyond that. This is now a wildlife disease, kind of wild health perspective. Whether it was bovine tuberculosis in the back in the 70s or the 90s. Or now with chronic wasting disease, the ethics kind of take a bit of a back seat to that, to now kind of concentrating on the wildfire that is chronic wasting disease, making sure it doesn't burn over the state.
And in any one tactic of hunting, and it could be still hunting. If there was some way that you're telling me still hunting increases the risk of spreading disease, I would reluctantly sit in a tree stand. I would, you'd hear about it. But I would. We
all know you're a wallflower, Drew.
Yeah. By the way, I actually brought my climber out into the woods, and I was thinking, man, I'm gonna hunt out of my climber. I'm gonna find a good tree. There's this certain spot that I think is a good sign, and I'm gonna hang it up there. I'm gonna sit still for the evening hunt. Man, I left that climber at the base of the tree, and I went still, and I'm like, I just can't. But yeah, if you brought the same kind of scientific evidence that is out there that shows that baiting increases the risk of spread of disease, and you told me that my tactic that I used did the same thing, I wouldn't like it, but I would sit in a tree. I just would. I would have to scout out preseason where the food sources are, where the bedding is, where those lanes are in between. I mean, I do that anyways, but when you're talking about baiting, what you're talking about is being able to hunt over a food source without locating the natural food sources. So what is your substitute? You got to do a little bit extra. You got to locate the natural food sources, or if you have the resources, create them.
Right.
So it's a little extra work, but understand that it is for the future health of the thing that we're all out there to hunt for now and into future generations. So where that stands now, the legislature has passed it, passed the House, passed the Senate. I think the House still has to concur in it, unless they did that on Thursday when I was at deer camp.
I did see, yeah.
But then it has to get signed by the governor. Indications are she's not in support of it. The DNR is definitely opposed to it. And so it's kind of up to Governor Gretchen Whitmer to veto that, not to stick it to hunters. She's got to veto that to help hunters, to preserve the future of our deer herd that supports hunting in Michigan. And that's where we like to see this. Of course, our affiliate, Michigan United Conservation Clubs, has been the absolute leader on this. They've organized other groups in support of this, including Farm Bureau even, Quality Deer Management Association, National Wildlife Federation, Ducks Unlimited, and all these different groups, not just because of the baiting, actually most of them, despite the baiting thing, but because of Proposal G, because it is politicizing an issue that should be made by professional wildlife biologists. And actually, I don't know if you know this, back in 1996, the National Wildlife Federation passed a resolution that held up Michigan's Natural Resources Commission as a model for other states. And the
That's
resolution said that we support scientific wildlife management made by professional wildlife biologists through citizens commissions like Michigan's, and for those states that don't already have those, they ought to adopt them.
There you go.
And that was that same year for the same reason. So that's, we always talk about when NWF gets involved in an issue, our state affiliates like Minnesota Conservation Federation, like Wisconsin Wildlife Federation, Michigan United Conservation Clubs, all those different state affiliates that are independent get together and set our policy. And back in 1996, they got together and set that policy, and that's why we wade into issues like this now when they arise.
Sure. The other dynamic to this that I mentioned before, just the whole, my hunting camp, your hunting camp, all of our hunting camps are getting older, we're getting smaller, is that R3 component, that recruit, retain, reactivate, new, old, just generally bring people to the sport. There's a baiting issue there too, and then that, if many folks feel that if you're seeing less deer, people aren't going to want to be in the woods. I would argue, I'd hope that deer hunting is so much more than seeing 10 deer at the pile in front of you, that it's the experience of being in the woods, the experience being with your dad, being with your uncle, being with your mom, being with your aunt, whoever it might be that's taking you into the woods. Being able to pull the triggers is icing on the cake. And my hope is that we're going to work extra hard, just as hard, Drew, you, myself, our colleagues, to getting new folks out into the field. Next year, when my son's 10 years old and able to join us, it's not going to be behind a bait pile, but it will be in the woods with me. And so, I guess I would challenge, the listeners and each of us here to try to figure out how to bring more folks into the woods, to kind of counteract that unfortunate slide we've gotten in license sales.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, but if you're hunting, don't just buy one license.
Yeah.
I didn't get any deer this year, unfortunately. Season's not over. I may yet get out again, although I don't know. Thanksgiving weekend would really be my only opportunity, and that's a discussion yet to be had. But I bought 3 licenses.
Hope your wife's not listening.
She doesn't listen to the podcast. But I bought 3 licenses. I bought the combination tag in Michigan, which is 2 antlered tags, one restricted 4+, one unrestricted. That can be any antlered buck, any antlered deer. And I also drew a public land antlerless tag for the county where I hunt. And so I bought 3 licenses. And they say, okay, we're losing licenses. Okay, but I just bought 3. So I'm making up for at least 1 or 2 other people where that conservation funding comes in. So if you are a hunter, give yourself more opportunity. Buy as many licenses as you're able to legally. Not all states have that, and what you're allowed to. But you can help make up for some of the conservation funding as an individual hunter by stepping up and kind of making up for some of the loss that we're seeing as well.
Sounds good.
Well, congratulations on your doe.
Thank you.
I envy the venison that you're going to have in your freezer. I still hope to get
She's
some
hanging in
this
the
year.
garage right now. That's what we'll be doing tonight.
Because it's going to take a lot of squirrels this winter to try to make up for a whole deer with those coppers.
I think you're up for the task.
CCI bullets, but we'll see. This has been the National Wildlife Federation Outdoors Podcast. My guest has been Jason Dinsmore, Director of Conservation Partnerships for the Northern Great Lakes states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan for the National Wildlife Federation. And as always, the National Wildlife Federation Outdoors Podcast is supported by RepYourWater, their 3% for conservation commitment, and their help for our office to help stop Asian carp from getting into the Great Lakes.